Eyrie of the Crows is one of the most survivor-sided maps in DBD for quite a few different reasons, and Behavior even did a slight update to the map shortly after its initial release to add even stronger tiles to parts of the map that didn't have them before. Thankfully, they have now chosen to rework the map in an effort to make it more fair for both sides, which is great, but let's not forget that this is Behavior, and their knowledge of how to create fair maps, if we're being brutally honest, is pretty awful. So in this video, we're gonna do a walkthrough of the new reworked Eyrie of Crows, and I'll give you my honest feedback on how the map will play once it's released. To start, the layout of the map has been significantly altered. The original Eyrie was a massive rectangular shape and it was covered in strong tiles, pallets, and structures. A truly horrid map that really incentivized and rewarded Shift W gameplay. It was pretty impossible to fend generators naturally or get any kind of pressure from pushing survivors into each other. It really showed a complete and utter lack of any knowledge on how DBD is actually played. So now let's take a look at the rework and see what improvements have been made. As you can see, the map is roughly the same size, which is a very questionable design choice in my opinion. However, it is a different layout. Obviously, it's much more square than the original version, but it can still take a decent amount of time to traverse it from one side to the other. Moving on to the main building, it is mostly the same from a layout perspective. Only one of the two upstairs god palettes are able to spawn now though, instead of both, which is a welcome change. The downstairs east god window is much weaker now as it doesn't easily chain into any other loops, and once the breakable wall is gone, it will do very little. Yet the western god window is stronger now as it still connects directly to loops, but also stronger loops than before are able to spawn here, so getting rid of any pallets in this area early on is going to be really important for killers. Lastly, behind the main building now is essentially nothing but a dead zone alleyway, which is great. It makes the map feel a lot more fair and condensed. That said, there's a problematic issue here because it looks like a hook dead zone as well, and I guarantee that this will be abused massively by survivors if a hook isn't added somewhere closer to this area. I was already able to exploit this in the PTB with just Boil Over, which is getting a shadow buff when this rework releases. Alright, now let's move on to the second most significant structure on the map, Killer Shack, which now resides in the southwest corner instead of the southeast. On the original Eyrie, Shack spawned next to a line of really strong tiles that allowed survivors to chain them together quite easily. The reworked Shack placement is a tiny bit more isolated, which is a good thing. Ideally, the building would spawn with a more fixed rotation though. Right now, the window and door can spawn outward facing the map, which promotes Shift W gameplay instead of looping. The sidewall of Shack with no vaultable window or door should always spawn outward toward the map in my opinion, like on the Garden of Joy. Also, this version of Shack has always been extra difficult to mind game because the sidewall of Shack has a barred window that the survivors can look through at all times to keep track of the killer, so better than the original again, but still potentially problematic for certain killers or RNG layouts. Okay, so for the last locations of the map, we'll separate them into themed areas. The graveyard takes up the center part of the map, the playground is pretty much the entire eastern side of the map, and Shobo Valley, which takes up the westernmost strip of the map. So let's start with the center graveyard. It's very basic, it's just a bunch of mausoleums and fenced graves with pallets in between, nothing that can be easily mind gamed though. They're just the type of loops killers want to get rid of as fast as possible because once they do, the area basically becomes a giant dead zone, which seems fitting and is healthy for a part of the map that connects everything together. There's no windows at all here, so survivors are going to want to be careful not to use this area's resources up too quickly. Next, let's move on to the eastern playground. This is where you're going to be finding all of the country comfort loops like jungle gyms, TLs, and four walls, with a few generic loops thrown into the mix as well. Killers do need to be wary of this area. The loops aren't disgustingly chained together or anything like they are in the suffocation pit, but if you get too greedy for a mind game here, a good survivor will be able to punish you by making it to another strong tile while you're busy moonwalking like a dumbass. That said, the area isn't too strong and it looks like 3 walled tiles spawn here every time at the top, middle, and bottom. Lastly, we have Showboat Alley. This is basically a long cluster of random loops with a single walled tile spawning right in the middle. Nothing too complex is going on here. Next up, let's go over gen placements and line of sight. From what I was able to gather on the PTB, the gens are placed in really safe areas for survivors. They're basically wide open, making it difficult for a killer to get close before getting Shift W'd, which is a bit of a shame. Fortunately, the Shift W won't be as severe as the original map because survivors will most likely hit a map corner decently fast if pushed in the right direction. As always, the gens have light poles attached to them to make it easy for survivors to find them quickly. This is something that exists in pretty much every outdoor map, but I don't like it. It makes gens way too easy to find, which leads to way faster gen efficiency. It seems like a random outdated design choice that is just still around for really no reason and isn't even consistent either. Also, line of sight in general. How easy is it for the survivors to keep track of the killer? Well, considering that it's the brightest map in the game and the only large line of sight breaker is pushed to the top of the map, it's pretty easy to keep eyes on the killer at all times. As a result, the map heavily rewards brute force gameplay over tactical pathing, which will make it more difficult for stealth killers to keep up. More on that point, the little grass patches they added around for Trapper are pretty laughable. Trappers are not going to have a good time on this map. Overall though, killer players are no longer going to have that guaranteed loss feeling when the map is played. Survivors will also no longer be running Eyrie offerings as much unless they want to abuse the no-hook alley we talked about earlier. It's definitely a better balanced map than the original, a clear improvement but far from perfect. That said, I couldn't account for every RNG placement in my time on the PTB, so it's totally possible that the map could have unforeseen problems in that regard. It's still definitely a strong map for Survivor, it's just not completely broken like the original. Also, I'm really glad that BHVR is starting to recognize that their map design is a problem. In my opinion, it's actually the biggest problem in DBD. If I could, I would literally redesign or alter every map in the game right now. Hopefully, Garden of Joy is next on the list for a rework. Even though I do want to see Swamp reworks as well, I'd rather BHVR not touch Swamp until they've really got a firm grasp on how to actually make a fair map. Otherwise, we'll just get a mess of new horrible maps that look pretty. But that about does it. Let me know what map you want to see get reworked the most, and as always, thanks for watching and have a good one.